Hi everyone, and thank you for signing up for this TÜV SÜD webinar on the EU MDR impact on cardiovascular manufacturers. My name is Erlina. I will be your moderator today. So before we start, here's a quick introduction of the speaker today. We have with us Giovanni Di Rienzo, who is Global Director of the Cardiovascular Focus Team in TÜV SÜD. So Giovanni has more than 17 years of experience in the medical devices field, and approximately half of those who spend working as a cardiovascular product expert as well as team leader for another major notified body. And before that, he also held roles in the R&D departments of other medical type companies. So with that, I will now hand over the presentation over to Giovanni, who will kick off with an introduction on the market overview. Giovanni, over to you.
Thank you. Perfect. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. The aim of today's session is to provide an overview of the changes that the medical device manufacturer will face with the introduction of the new medical device regulation. I will not be able to cover in full all the new requirements of the regulation because of the time constraint, but I will try to focus on those that have the most significant impact on cardiovascular devices and probably more in general to high-risk devices. So let's start with the timeline for the introduction of the MDR. So this timeline you can see in this slide is probably something you have seen already a few times, but I thought it would be worth presenting it once more in order to show how the transition period, which at first sight might appear reasonable, is in fact quite, I would say, terribly short. The MDR was published in early May and officially entered into force on May 26, with a 3-year transition period that will lead us to May 2020. So are we actually in the transition period at the moment? Yes and no. Actually, nobody can issue certificate under the MDR at the moment because no notified body has been designated under the MDR. Actually, the European Commission has not even set the rules for designation of notified bodies yet. However, those rules should be defined in the next few months, and notified body will be able to apply for an MDR designation from November the 26th. From that point, notified body will be audited and at some point will be designated. The expectation was to have the first wave of notified bodies designated sometime in 2018, so sometime next year. However, at the moment, nobody really knows when the designation process will begin and when it will be completed. And the rumors at the moment seem to suggest that 2018 might be quite an optimistic forecast. So bad news is that actually the transition period will not be 3 years, but will be probably 2 years in the very best case, probably even less than that. Good news is that on top of this transition period, there will be an additional grace period or soft transition, as somebody else called it, from 2020 to 2024. So how does this soft transition period work? Basically, all certificates issued under the Medical Device Directive before May 2020 will continue to be valid up to the 27th of May 2024 or up to their natural expiry date if that happens before. So in the period 2020 to 2024, notified bodies will not be allowed to issue, reissue, or renew any Medical Device Directive certificate, but those already issued will remain valid up to 2024. However, there are 3 conditions to maintain MDD certificates during the grace period, and those are that the post-market surveillance and the vigilance requirements of the MDR are met, that the requirements for registration of devices and economic operators are met, and that no significant changes are introduced to the device covered by this certificate. So I will now touch on some of the changes in the legislation that might have an impact on specifically on cardiovascular manufacturers. First of all, let's have a look at the scope of the MDR. There are no changes in the scope of the regulation that we would expect to significantly impact cardiovascular devices. However, I thought it would be appropriate at least briefly touching on the scope of the regulation. The MDR covers medical devices and their accessories. The definition of medical device has been slightly changed, but I would not expect that to have an impact on the most traditional cardiovascular devices. If your device is particularly innovative or it's in some way special, you might want to have a better look at the definition and see if there is some impact, as the scope is not literally identical to the one of the Medical Device Directive. The main changes in the scope are that now active implantable devices are included and are not covered anymore by a separate piece of legislation, and that the MDR now also covers products without a specific medical purpose. So let's move on to something that might have more of an impact on cardiovascular devices, which is the classification of devices. There are currently 18 rules in the MDD, and those will become 22 in the MDR. The grouping is unchanged for the ruling: non-active devices, invasive devices, active devices, and special rules. We will specifically talk about invasive device and about the special rules, as those might have an impact on cardiovascular devices. So there are quite a few changes and quite a few new rules introduced, but I will focus mostly on those devices that are used in contact with the central circulatory system and those devices that incorporate a medicinal substance. So the three rules that are typically applicable to cardiovascular devices under the directive are Rule 6, 7, and 8. Those are related to surgically invasive and implantable devices. The numbering of the rules will not change in the MDR, so the homologous rules will remain 6, 7, and 8. Rule 8 for implantable devices has no significant changes, while in Rule 6 and 7, some modifications have been introduced that might change the classification of some cardiovascular devices. So far, under the MDD, surgical invasive devices have been classified as Class 3 when they are intended to be used in contact with the heart or with the central circulatory system and are specifically intended to treat those anatomies. Devices like heart valve sizers, for example, that are in contact with the heart but are not intended to control, diagnose, monitor, or correct a defect of the heart or of the central circulatory system, are currently classified as Class 2A. However, under the MDR, the contact with the heart or with the central circulatory system becomes sufficient to apply a Class 3 classification. So it's no longer necessary for the device to be intended to treat those specific parts of the bodies. The contact is sufficient. So heart valve sizers, for example, will be Class 3 under the MDR. And other devices that might be affected are, for example, certain type of guide wires. Guide wires intended, for example, to deliver devices in the peripheral vasculature, but touching the central circulatory system to reach those vessels. So please note, I'm not talking of any guide wires. I'm just talking of some very specific group of guide wires that will be reclassified. The third classification rule, which will have an impact on cardiovascular manufacturers, and probably not only on them, is Rule 14 of the MDR. This rule is related to drug-device combination and is analogous to Rule 13 in the directive. The rules are very similar. However, some very important words have been removed in the regulation, and those are shown in blue in this slide, and are which is liable to act on the human body. So at the moment, under the MDD, a device can incorporate a drug and still not be classified as Class 3 in some circumstances. This happens if the substance is not liable to act on the human body. So in most cases, medicinal substances are actually liable to act on the human body. However, there are a few cases, for example, when the amount of drug is very small or the drug is not actually released from the device, where it can be proved based on scientific evidence that the substance has no effect whatsoever. Well, this way out of a class 3 classification is no longer available in the MDR. So every device which incorporates a drug is class 3. No matter the amount, no matter the effect of the substance, the class 3 classification is automatic if a medicinal substance is incorporated. Let's now have a look at the possible conformity assessment route, as there are some changes here, especially for medium, high, and high-risk devices, meaning class 2B and class 3 devices. So there are two main procedures. One you can see on the left-hand side of this slide according to Annex 9, which is the equivalent of the current Annex 2 under the directive, and one according to Annex 10, with or without Annex 11. This second option is the type examination type of route, which is quite unusual for cardiovascular devices. So the main difference that will have an impact on cardiovascular manufacturers is related to implantable devices classified as class 2B. Those are, for example, peripheral stents or peripheral vascular grafts. Those will be assessed in a way that is entirely similar to class 3 devices. So the technical documentation, which under the directive is audited on a sample basis, will have to be reviewed for each single individual class 2B implantable devices. So basically, in terms of conformity assessment, there will be very few differences between class 3 and class 2B implantable devices. Class 2B non-implantable and class 2A devices will continue to follow a procedure similar to the current one, which means an assessment of the quality system together with an assessment of the technical documentation on a sample basis. Another significant change been introduced to the procedure described in Chapter 5 of Annex 9, and those include some procedures already well known, for instance, the consultation for devices incorporating a medicinal substance, the consultation for devices that incorporate animal tissue. But there are also some new procedures that we'll see a bit more in details in a few minutes while discussing the clinical requirements. So it's also worth mentioning that reusable surgical instrument classified as class 1 will require some level of notified body involvement for their CE approval. So those are the one identified in this slide with the acronym 1RSI. Okay, let's move on to the requirements of the MDR. The requirements are no longer called essential requirements, but are called now general safety and performance requirements. The number of the requirements have increased from 13 in the directive to 23 in the MDR. And that already tells you something about the increased level of details that is expected. In principle, the requirements are quite similar to those of the directive. However, there is, I would say, much more emphasis on risk and much more emphasis on the concept of state-of-the-art. There is no time to go into the fine details of each requirement today. However, I think it's important mentioning to manufacturers of cardiovascular devices the more specific requirements regarding substances that might be carcinogenic, mutagenic, or toxic to reproduction, with a clear threshold introduced, which is 0.1% weight on weight. There are also new requirements for labels and for AFU, which include reprocessing information if the device can be reused, an implant card for device intended to be permanently implanted. So let's talk a bit more in details about the implant card. An implant card will become a requirement for any implantable devices, irrespective of their classification, so not necessarily only Class 3 device, any implantable device. The implant card will have to include information, the information necessary to identify the device, for example, serial number, etc., model number, and to identify the legal manufacturer. The information supplied to the patient will also have to include warning, precautions for the patient, information about the expected lifetime and the necessary follow-up, and any other information relevant to the patient. The implant card is a document prepared and provided for the patient together with the device, and it will have to be written in a lay language that can be understood by the implanted patient and not necessarily just by the clinician. And we'll have to point to the manufacturer's website for any possible update. So let's now move to the tricky bit and talk a bit about the clinical and the post-market requirements introduced by the MDR. As you know, we are currently transitioning from a regulatory world, so to say, a year ago or so, where clinical evaluation were assessed according to the MDD and based on the guidance of MedDev 2.7-1 revision 3. And we are transitioning to a world where we will assess according to the MDR and potentially to a further new revision of the guidance document. So at the moment, we are in an intermediate phase. The MDD is still the document we are using to assess compliance, but it will go in parallel with the MDR in 12 months or so. And we are using a new revision of the guidance, so we are using revision 4 of the MedDev guidance. So just looking at the size in terms of pages of this document, you can tell how far higher the bar has been and will be raised in the future. So let's start talking about clinical evaluation. According to the MDR and to the MedDev guidance, a clinical evaluation is a scientific and systematic way to gather and analyze clinical data in order to demonstrate compliance with the regulatory requirements. And it's up to the manufacturers to determine the level of clinical data necessary for this purpose. According to Article 61 of the MDR, clinical data can be obtained for clinical investigation and from the scientific literature. Data from the literature can be used, obviously, when equivalence is demonstrated with the device discussed in the paper. So far, it appears as if the equivalence route was still a viable option. However, we'll see that the reality is rather different. So it's important to highlight also from this slide that the literature is also required to determine the current state of the art and not only to prove safety and effectiveness. So let's talk a bit more about equivalence. To support an equivalence argument, 3 aspects must be addressed. So the device must be equivalent from a technical, biological, and clinical perspective. In extreme summary, technical equivalence means similar design properties, specification, and so on. Biological equivalence means same or similar material used in contact with the same tissues. And clinical equivalence means same indication for use, same intended use, and use for the same patient population. So the concept is not really different from the equivalent concept as presented in MedDev 2.7-1 revision 4. However, part of the wording is not identical. So they say the devil is in the details, so my suggestion is to carefully read Annex 14 of the MDR. So equivalence must be scientifically proved by means of data and actual evidence. And, well, since 2 devices cannot be 100% identical, otherwise we would call them identical, not equivalent, the differences must be disclosed and analyzed, and the two devices can be said to be equivalent if the difference that they naturally have no impact on the clinical safety and the clinical performance of the device. So that's the threshold. I mentioned a couple of slides ago that the equivalence route might still appear a viable option. However, the route has been significantly narrowed for Class 3 and for all implantable devices. For those, the MDR require, as a general rule, the data to be sourced from a clinical investigation. So is the literature route completely closed for this device? Actually, the regulation leaves a glimpse of hope also for those, and includes 3 exceptions to the general rules. So we are going to see these 3 exceptions one by one, and well, you'll notice how difficult the equivalence path has become. First possible exception to the clinical investigation rule is for those devices that are designed by modification of some product that is already on the market and is marketed by the same manufacturer. So we are talking of something like a line extension or a design change to your own device. For those devices, a clinical investigation is not required if 2 conditions are met, so that the 2 devices can be proved to be equivalent based on the technical, biological, and clinical characteristics, as discussed a couple of slides ago, and that the clinical evaluation of the marketed device is sufficient to demonstrate conformity with the relevant safety and performance requirements. So sufficient is the key word here. What is sufficient clinical data? It's data relevant to the device and of sufficient quality to demonstrate compliance with the general safety and performance requirements. The way data are generated, for example, to a large randomized clinical trial as opposed to a small retrospective study, and also biostatistic consideration play a significant role in determining the quality of the data. So to have some more detailed guidance on how to determine quality and relevance of the clinical data, I would point you to MedDev 2.7-1 revision 4, where these concepts are quite extensively discussed, and there are quite several useful examples. So last thing I want to highlight regarding this first exception is that in this case, the post-market clinical follow-up will be particularly scrutinized, and some thorough post-market studies are expected. Second possible exception to the clinical investigation rule is for devices that can be proved to be equivalent to a device marketed by another manufacturer. So this is the route that is largely used today under the directive. However, the MDR is introducing a significant limitation. So to be able to use data from a competitive device, a manufacturer must have a contract in place to allow them full access to the technical documentation of their competitor. So this option, although it is theoretically possible, is likely to be used in an extremely low number of cases. I can't really imagine manufacturers offering as a gift to their competitors the chance to easily get into the market. So this might happen in some cases because perhaps of joint ventures or companies being part of the same group, but I would expect it to be a viable option in a very, very limited number of situations. So it goes without saying that the second condition to use this exception is that the data available for the marketed devices must be in compliance with the MDR. So we are back again to the concept of having sufficient clinical data. The third and final exception is applicable to devices that are already certified under the MDD or the IMDD. The MDR does not have any grandfathering process, so all the devices, even if they are already CE-marked, will have to be reassessed and recertified according to the new legislation. However, if those are approved based on sufficient clinical data, and we are talking of sufficient clinical data from an MDR perspective. And if the clinical evaluation is compliant with the relevant common specification, if a common specification is available, a clinical investigation is not a mandatory requirement. So let's start commenting the exception from the easy part, so the common specification. At the moment, no common specification has been published, and we don't know exactly when those will start being available. The Commission is very likely to prioritize common specification for high-risk novel devices and for devices that are not covered by international standards, or if there is a standard where the standard is not detailed enough. So it's not unlikely that some cardiovascular devices will be subject of some early common specification. However, at the moment, none is published, so there is no requirement to be compliant yet. The critical part of the exception is, again, the requirement for sufficient clinical data. So the quality, the amount, the relevance of the data should be sufficient to scientifically demonstrate compliance with the requirements of the MDR. A typical critical situation is the situation of manufacturers that are marketing legacy devices that perhaps have been on the market for many years, maybe 20 years, and are possibly not particularly novel. A classical example in the cardiovascular field is a guide wire. Devices maybe were approved without a clinical investigation and no other data were generated since launch. So the only available data might be complaints and vigilance reports and perhaps some anecdotal report. Well, that is not sufficient clinical data according to the MDR, and some evidence will have to be gathered before a recertification under the MDR. So the dilemma most manufacturers, not most, but many manufacturers are facing is whether it's worth generating clinical data in the next few years or rather just discontinuing a product line in Europe, for example. So how is the situation for devices that are not implantable and that are not class 3? It's actually a little easier. There is no strict requirement for clinical investigation, and an equivalence route is still an actual option. However, the equivalence argument must be very solid and based on data and on a scientific justification, and the notified body will challenge the manufacturing regarding the level of access to the data of the equivalence device. Full access to technical documentation and the contract in place is not required in this case, but some level of access to the data of the equivalent device should be proved. So we have talked so far of the extra requirements for demonstrating compliance with the general safety and performance requirements. Now let's have a look at the additional processes required and the additional reports that will have to be generated and regularly updated. First of those is the summary of safety and clinical performance. This document will be required for class 3 and for implantable devices, and it's aimed at increasing the transparency in the approval process. So it's aimed at the final user of the device, and again, like the implant card, should be written in a language clear to the final user. In most cases, the final user of a cardiovascular device is either a doctor or a trained clinician. However, for other type of devices, the final user could be a lay person, and therefore the document should be written in a suitable language. So the summary of safety and clinical performance should include a detailed description of the device, its intended use, possible alternative for the treatment of the same condition, and it should provide reference to the standard and the common specification to which the manufacturer claims compliance, and suggestions regarding the required training and the profile of the user. A key part of the document is a summary of the clinical evaluation, including relevant information from the post-market clinical follow-up. The summary of safety and clinical performance is not a static document. it should be prepared the first time for the approval of the product and then should be updated at least annually. The document will have to be validated by a notified body and should be referenced in the instruction for use, and it should be a public document made publicly available through the EUDAMED database. So this is already a significant extra burden for manufacturers, as the document will have to be prepared and updated regularly. But to be honest, it's also a big extra workload for notified bodies that will be expected to review and validate its summary of safety and clinical performance for thousands of devices every year. So the MDR gives the opportunity also for a voluntary consultation with an expert panel, which is typically happens at an early stage of the clinical development, specifically before a clinical investigation is initiated or before a clinical evaluation is completed. The consultation is open to manufacturers of Class 3 devices and Class 2B devices intended to administer or remove a medicinal substance. And the aim of this consultation is to provide some early feedback to the clinical strategy. So if a manufacturer decides to go through this voluntary consultation, they will have to give adequate consideration to the view expressed by the expert panel and document those views in the clinical evaluation report. However, the expert panel's feedback will not give the manufacturer any rights with regard to the actual conformity assessment. So basically, if the expert panel's feedback is negative, this will not be binding, but should be taken in consideration. If the expert panel's opinion is positive, it will not be a guarantee of success of the actual CE assessment. So let me just underline once again that this process is not a mandatory process, but it's totally voluntary. There is a mandatory consultation process, and this is required for Class 3 implantable devices and Class 2B devices intended to administer or remove a medicinal substance. So for those devices, the notified body is required to review the clinical evaluation report and the post-market clinical follow-up plan, to prepare a report, which is shown in this slide with the acronym CEAR, so Clinical Evaluation Assessment Report. And this report will have to be submitted to the European Commission, which will pass it immediately to an expert panel for an opinion. This consultation is not required anytime a certificate for a Class 3 implantable, Class 2B active device is issued or reissued. There are exceptions when this consultation is not required. There are three exceptions, basically. So for renewal of certificates that are already issued under the MDR, for the modification of an existing device marketed by the same manufacturer, if the intended purpose isn't changed and the risk-benefit ratio is not affected. So for line extension, design change, if the risk-benefit is not affected and the intended purpose isn't changed. And third exception, when the clinical evaluation is in compliance with the relevant common specification. We said earlier on that at the moment we don't have common specification. We hope to have a few of them in the future, and when this will be published, this exception will be applicable. So if we are not falling into one of these three situations, the notified body will have to trigger this consultation process. The consultation process will not always be completed. The expert panel has 3 weeks to decide whether or not they want to provide a scientific opinion, and the decision as to whether or not provide this opinion will be taken based on the novelty of the device and on specific risk benefits or safety concerns that are coming from the market. If the expert panel decides to provide the opinion, this will have to be provided within 60 days. And I'm talking of 60 days, including the initial 21. So it is not 60 plus 21, but it's a total of 60 days. The panel opinion, once again, is not binding. However, the notified body will have to give due consideration to this opinion and provide a very solid justification if the panel opinion is not followed. The situation is basically quite similar to the drug consultation that are currently conducted under the MDD. So the drug agency opinion is just an opinion, is not binding. However, in most cases, notified body do not decide to overrule the drug agency opinion. So does this sound like enough scrutiny? Well, not really for the European Commission. For them, there is some further scrutiny mechanism, and this again will be applicable for Class 3 implantable devices and Class 2B devices intended to administer or remove a medicinal substance. The notified body in these cases will have to notify the competent authorities when a certificate for one of those devices is issued. The notification will have to be done through EUDAMED and should include a series of documents, so the summary of safety and clinical performance, the clinical evaluation assessment report, the clinical evaluation including the expert panel opinion, if an expert panel opinion was sought, and the instruction for use of the device. Once received the notification, competent authority or the European Commission might decide to subject the device to further scrutiny. So it might or might not happen. Let me point out that this further assessment will be done post-market. So it's a process that might be triggered post-approval of the device and will not have an impact on the approval timeline. So we are now moving from the pre-market to the post-market phase, and let's start talking about the post-market requirements. The requirements for post-market surveillance in the MDR are not entirely new, but are definitely enhanced as compared to the MDD. So what is post-market surveillance? Post-market surveillance is a tool to collect clinical data, basically. Earlier we mentioned, for example, clinical investigation, or we mentioned literature reviews, and PMS is just another way of collecting clinical data. Manufacturers are required to establish a PMS system as part of their quality system, and this PMS system should be based on a plan and should be aimed to actively and systematically obtaining and analyzing information from the market throughout the entire lifetime of the device. So again, we see the lifetime approach typical of the MDR. PMS is not static and conducted once and for all, but is a continuous and ongoing process. So the post-market surveillance will allow to monitor continuously the risk-benefit ratio, to update the risk management, to identify need for preventive or corrective action, to detect trends, to update the clinical evaluation report, and so on. As you can see in this slide, a subset of the post-market surveillance data are the data obtained through post-market clinical follow-up. So post-market clinical follow-up is typically taught as a clinical study. However, there are several possible methodologies to conduct a post-market clinical follow-up. So PMCF can certainly be a new prospective study, but can also take other form, like, for example, a registry or the extended follow-up of patients already enrolled in the pre-market study, or, for example, a retrospective studies. The type of post-market clinical follow-up very much depends on the type of device, on how well-established the device is, on the amount of data available, and on the unknowns that have to be investigated, because PMCF is aimed to assess unknowns. Those might be, for example, the medium and long-term safety and performance that in some devices cannot be practically assessed to a full extent in the pre-market phase, or other unknowns like rare complications, effect of safety and performance of a more widespread real-world use of the device. So the PMCF is aimed to answer all those unanswered questions. With the aim of increasing transparency and monitoring the devices continuously, the MDRs requires another document to be prepared and regularly updated. This is the Periodic Safety Update Report, or also called PSUR sometimes. The report will have to be prepared for Class 3 and Class 2A and 2B devices. It will have to present an analysis of the data obtained through the post-market surveillance, including those from the PMCF, the description of any preventive and corrective action implemented, the conclusion on the risk-benefit determination. It should also include volume of sales and estimate of the user population and frequency of use. The PSUR will be updated at least annually for Class 3 and 2B devices, and at least every other year for Class 2A devices. I specifically said at least because the PSUR will also have to be updated when necessary. So whenever there is a significant information from the market that might impact safety or that might impact the risk-benefit profile of the devices. For Class 3 and 2B implantable devices, the PSUR will have to be submitted to the notified body for review at each update, so at least once a year. The notified body will add their report of the review and some details of any action taken, if any, and all this will be made available to competent authorities through the EUDAMED database. For Class 2B devices not implantable and for Class 2A devices, the PSUR will be part of the technical documentation and will review as part of the regular technical documentation reviews or whenever necessary. So this was really a quick overview of the main changes impacting high-risk devices, where there is a lot of other aspects that will change under the MDR and will have to be addressed. We don't really have time to go through the details, every detail today, but I wanted at least to mention a few of those other aspects. So the MDR is introducing some very specific requirements for conducting clinical investigation, and those are to some extent aligned to ISO 14155, but with some extra requirements. There will be requirements for UDI and single registration number for manufacturers. Authorized representative, distributor, importers will have significantly increased responsibility. There will be specific requirements for reprocessed and for custom-made devices. And there are new, or perhaps I should say better clarified requirements for private labelers with full responsibility falling on the final legal manufacturer, and probably a few more new requirements. Let's now briefly move on to planning to be ready for the MDR. We have seen a timeline at the beginning of this session, and we already commented as to the limited time available for the transition. That we said in the very best case, the actual transition period will be less than 2 years, but realistically quite less than 2 years. So we have some very general indication as to what should be done to be ready and compliant in time. I've divided the activities in 2 phases. The first one is an analysis and planning stage. We could call it an impact assessment if you want. Manufacturers should read the MDR, assess the impact of their product, and possibly clarify some aspect with their notified body and prepare a plan of activities with clear priority. So the second phase is the implementation phase. So manufacturers should start assessing more in detail their devices' compliance with the requirements of the MDR, identify the gaps, and start addressing those gaps. And most important of all, start collecting new data if new data is necessary. It's also important in this phase to think about resources. we have seen there will be a significant extra burden, especially on high-risk devices. So it's possible you will need some extra manpower. And you will also have to assign new roles and new responsibility, like, for instance, the person responsible for regulatory compliance. It's important at this stage you also start looking at your quality system and at your supply chain and make sure your procedures are in line with new requirements and your authorized representatives, importers, distributors are also ready for the task. Last but not least, you should start thinking what notified body you want to work with during this transition. Notified bodies like manufacturers will be under significant strain in this period and will have to adapt and prepare to the change. So it's very important you assess your notified body's plan and readiness, because there is no point for manufacturers in planning carefully and being ready at the right time if the notified body cannot move at the same pace. So make sure your notified body is ready and possibly that is ready now. So the message and my general advice is to start working on the MDR as early as possible. Hopefully, most manufacturers have already gone through the planning phase and are well within the implementation step. If not, please start very soon, because the transition period is short and much short than it might appear at our first look. So what can TÜV SÜD do to help manufacturers during the smooth transition? Let's start on a negative note, if you want, and see what we can't do. TÜV SÜD, as a notified body responsible for conformity assessment, cannot provide consultancy services. It's not our job. We are not legally allowed to do consultancy, and it would undermine our designation as a notified body. There are plenty of good consultants out there, and we are not trying to compete with them. So do not expect from TÜV SÜD solution advice, suggestion on how to meet the requirements. However, we can do what we do every day, meaning we can conduct conformity assessment and highlight findings, gaps, observations, and so on. So it's true we are not designated under the MDR yet. No notified body is designated under the MDR yet. So we cannot issue certificates under the MDR. However, our processes and procedures are ready and our experts are trained, so we can do some sort of simulated or mock assessment of the technical documentation or mock quality system audit. The outcome will not be a certificate, but it will be some early feedback on the readiness of the documentation and quality system and a report highlighting all the possible gaps. This mock assessment will not reduce the duration of the real MDR assessment. All devices will be subject to the same MDR assessment in the future. So why are they useful? They are useful because they allow manufacturers to get some early feedback and get better prepared. They allow to better understand the expectation of notified bodies. They allow to avoid surprises down the line, and most of all, they allow to start effectively working on the MDR ahead of time. All manufacturers will apply for MDR certification in a very limited period of time. We mentioned 2 years in the best case. So some level of notified body overload is expected, and starting now is an option to reduce possible delays due to a peak of applications. So this concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, your participation. I hope you had a general idea of what is coming in the next years or months. And, well, as I said, in order to keep the section reasonably short, there are several aspects that were not touched. So my suggestion to everybody is to go and read very carefully the text of the regulation, if you haven't already done it, and possibly read it again a few times, because it's a long and complex document, and it really takes some time to understand the details and the impact of all. So now I hand it back to Erlina.
So we hope that you found the session interesting. Thank you so much for your questions. Just another reminder that we will respond to you via email directly for those we were not able to respond live in this webinar. So to get the latest news, any updates on MDR and other MHS-related topics, we encourage you to sign up for the Healthcare and Medical Device Essentials. It is a e-newsletter at tuvsud.com/MHS. And also follow us on our LinkedIn Showcase page. That's where we publish the latest news as and when it gets published. So in addition, if you have any other questions on this topic or what we do, please feel free to email us at mhs@tuvsud.com and we will get in touch with you directly as well. So thanks again, Giovanni. Thank you everyone for your time and have a good rest of the day ahead.